It was the kind of morning that clung to your skin, a sticky southern humidity that made even the air feel heavy with judgment. Inside the Montgomery County Courthouse, a different kind of pressure was building. The grand, white-pillared structure had stood for over a century, but its age wasn't just in its bricks. It was in its ways, its silence, and the stories it refused to tell. Judge Ronald Whitmore entered his courtroom with a slow, deliberate pace. Every heel click echoed authority, his black robe billowing like a shadow behind him. 62 years old, square-jawed with silver hair and eyes like wet stone, Whitmore was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to make you feel small. He believed in two things, control and compliance, and the courtroom was where. He reminded the world of both. The morning docket was routine, minor offenses, low-level charges. A few traffic violations, a trespassing case, and the usual slew of missed court appearances. Nothing he couldn't crush before lunch. At exactly 9:05 a.m., the courtroom door opened. A man walked in, tall, black, sharply dressed in a tailored, navy blue suit that contrasted beautifully against his dark skin. He carried himself with a quiet precision, as if each step had been measured, rehearsed. He didn't rush. He didn't apologize. His name echoed softly through the murmur of the court as he approached the defense podium. Marcus Reed. Judge Whitmore barely glanced up. "You're late," he said flatly, tapping his pen on the bench. "Not a good first impression." Reed looked at the courtroom clock. It read 9:05. "Your Honor, according to the schedule provided by the clerk's office, my case was to begin at 9:15. Whitmore's jaw flexed. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Reed," he said, voice dipping into a dangerous calm. "Not yours. When I say a case begins, it begins." The gavel cracked once, sharp, final. The room quieted. Reed offered no argument. He simply adjusted the cuff of his sleeve and stood tall. Judge Whitmore read over the file with a faint smirk. "Improper lane change. Speeding in a residential zone. Failure to signal. You've been busy." Reed's eyebrows lifted slightly. "With respect, Your Honor, the traffic stop in question is being contested. I was not exceeding the speed limit and my dash cam—" "This is not a courtroom for stories," Whitmore interrupted. "It's a courtroom for justice. The officer's sworn statement contradicts your version." Reed stared ahead, calm, controlled. "May I submit video evidence for the record?" Whitmore waved dismissively. "Later, if I decide it's necessary." The bailiff stood at attention. The prosecutor, a young assistant district attorney with a nervous disposition, barely looked up from his notes. This wasn't a case to win. It was just paperwork. No one cared about the truth. Not really, except Reed. Because Reed knew what was happening. He had seen it before, felt it in courtrooms, in meetings, in handshakes that lingered just a moment too long as people calculated what kind of man he was. He was black, confident, articulate, and not apologizing for any of it. To some men that was a challenge, and to Judge Whitmore it was an insult. The courtroom walls seemed to lean in closer, listening. The ceiling fan hummed with indifference. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Whitmore leaned forward. "You have a choice, Mr. Reed. Pay the fine $200 and walk out of here today. Or contest it, and we proceed to trial, where I assure you the penalties could be more significant." Reed's expression didn't change. "Your Honor, I believe the citation was issued unfairly and with bias. I'd like my day in court." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Then let me be clear. If you waste the court's time, you'll be held in contempt. Do you understand?" "I understand the law, Your Honor," Reed said. Something in that sentence shifted the air. Not the words themselves, but the way he said them. Calm, assertive, like someone speaking not just to a judge, but as someone who knew exactly how far the judge could go. Whitmore noticed it too. He sat back, lips tightening. "I see," he said. "We'll schedule trial for next month. In the meantime, consider this hearing closed, with a court administrative fee, $100. He looked directly at Reed. "Don't be late next time." Reed nodded once. "I won't." As he turned to leave, he met the judge's eyes. Just for a moment. Not defiant, not aggressive, but unafraid. It was the look of someone who had stood in rooms like this before, rooms that didn't expect people like him to stand tall. Rooms that thought a robe gave someone the right to humiliate another man in front of strangers. Rooms that fed on silence. Marcus Reed didn't feed that system, and Judge Whitmore knew in the marrow of his bones that this man wasn't like the others. He couldn't explain why, but something about him rattled his confidence. Something told him that the courtroom battle he thought he'd already won was only just beginning. Marcus sat in his car for a moment after leaving the courtroom, hands on the steering wheel, breathing deeply through the fury that tried to claw its way up from his chest like a fire demanding to erupt. But he didn't let it. Not yet. Not here. Not when he knew that the moment he reacted like the stereotype they feared, they'd win. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful form of protest was composed silence, not surrender, but strategy. And in that moment, staring at the old bricks of the courthouse behind him, he realized this wasn't just a traffic citation, wasn't just one arrogant judge with a bad attitude. This was a microcosm of the very disease he had sworn to fight when he took his oath as a federal prosecutor. And something about today, something in Whitmore's voice, the way he smirked, the certainty that Marcus would break, made it personal in a way he hadn't felt since law school, when a professor had once praised his argument only to follow it up with, "You're very articulate for someone like you," and Marcus even then hadn't needed to ask what that meant. He had grown up in Baltimore, son of a public school teacher and a sanitation worker, the middle of 3 kids, and though his parents never let him speak back to adults, they taught him something more dangerous. They taught him to remember, everything to observe, to analyze, to file away every slight, every smirk, every moment when someone underestimated him, and use it, not for revenge, but for clarity, for fuel, for justice. And that was exactly what he planned to do now. So instead of driving away, Marcus walked to the courthouse clerk's office, requested a copy of the court transcript and footage from the day's hearing, citing federal procedure codes that made the clerk's eyes widen just slightly, and then calmly, politely, requested Whitmore's past ruling history on traffic violations for the last 5 years, broken down by race and fine amount, knowing full well that the public records would tell a story far more damning than any personal testimony. And as he walked out again, this time with documents in hand, he dialed his assistant back at the DOJ regional office in Atlanta and said, "I need you to flag Montgomery County for a preliminary civil rights review, starting with Whitmore." And that was when the real case began, not in front of the judge, but behind him, in the rooms he couldn't see, the reports he didn't know were being pulled, the conversations he didn't realize were starting. But before Marcus could act officially, he needed one more thing, undeniable proof of bias, and that meant returning to the courtroom, not as a prosecutor, not yet, but as a defendant again, to play the role they expected, to let them underestimate him just long enough for the trap to close, because Marcus knew exactly how men like Whitmore thought. They assumed power was permanent, assumed the robe made them untouchable, assumed that a black man in a suit was a defendant who had borrowed dignity for the day, but would return it by nightfall. And Marcus would give Whitmore just enough rope to feel safe, then pull. So he showed up to the next pretrial hearing early, dressed just as sharply, briefcase in hand, and waited silently, while Whitmore took his seat with that same smug look, that subtle sneer that said, "Here we go again." And as the courtroom, filled with the quiet ritual of routine injustice, Marcus felt something shift. Not in the judge, not in the room, but in himself. A certainty, a clarity, like a switch had flipped and the mask had come off. Whitmore opened the hearing by announcing that Reed's challenge to the citation would be reviewed, but that in light of additional complications, the court would be imposing an early compliance fee to ensure Reed understood the gravity of his infractions. And Marcus said nothing, even as the fine climbed to over $2,000, even as the judge laughed lightly and said, "You're free to appeal, but good luck with that." Because Marcus knew the higher court circuit, and he knew what kind of red flags would explode on the judge's record the moment that appeal hit the desk, especially when paired with the statistical breakdown of fines issued to minorities in Whitmore's courtroom, especially when paired with a federal badge and a legal team with national oversight clearance. And still, Marcus played the part, nodding, remaining polite, asking for a hearing date, thanking the clerk, walking out slowly and methodically, letting every single person in that courtroom believe they had just watched a man humiliated and broken by the system, when in fact they had just witnessed a fuse being lit, because behind the scenes the wheels were turning fast. His supervisor at the DOJ had already greenlit a covert preliminary review of Montgomery County's municipal court system, and Marcus had pulled civil complaints filed in the last decade, cross-referencing them with outcomes, verdicts, and judge rotation schedules, and what he found wasn't just bias. It was a pattern, a system designed not only to punish, but to discourage appeal, to exhaust the people who tried to fight it, to weaponize procedure until justice was too expensive to pursue, and Judge Whitmore was at the center of it. A man who had been allowed to sit in power for over 20 years unchecked because he kept his racism professional, because he knew how to smile for the press and shake hands at church picnics and offer scholarships with one hand while signing arrest warrants with the other. But Marcus had learned early on that racism dressed in suits was still racism, and this time it had picked the wrong man to put on trial. At night, Marcus reviewed the footage from the hearing frame by frame, noting every moment Whitmore cut him off, every sneer, every refusal to acknowledge his legal rights as a defendant, then compared it to video from a white defendant who had appeared hours earlier on the same charges and had received a light warning and a reduced fine, and slowly, meticulously, Marcus built his case, not for a traffic ticket, but for a federal pattern and practice investigation, which, if successful, could strip Whitmore of the bench and trigger a Department of Justice intervention into the entire county's judicial process. And as the hearing date approached, Marcus filed his formal intent to represent himself in court, knowing it would give him the right to directly question the officer who issued the citation, expose the inconsistencies in the official report, and put on record the behavior of the judge himself. But what Whitmore didn't know was that Marcus had no intention of seeing the case to verdict. Instead, he had timed the hearing to align with the public announcement of the DOJ's investigation, a move that would turn a local ticket dispute into national news overnight. And when the day came, Marcus arrived at the courthouse flanked not by attorneys, but by quiet observers from the Civil Rights Division, dressed in plain clothes, sitting silently in the back rows, watching, listening, documenting everything. And when Whitmore began the session with another smirk, another monologue about respecting the law, Marcus waited until just the right moment, until the judge leaned in for dramatic effect, and then pulled out his badge, placed it calmly on the defense table and said, "Your Honor, for the record, I am Assistant United States Attorney Marcus Reed, here today not only as a defendant, but as the lead investigator into a formal federal inquiry into judicial misconduct and racial bias in this courtroom." And the silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was history turning a corner. The air inside Judge Ronald Whitmore's courtroom had always belonged to him, cold, judgmental, sharpened by years of power unchallenged. But on this afternoon, something invisible shifted, something not yet spoken but already present, a kind of storm gathering inside walls that had never known accountability. And as Whitmore adjusted his robe, flipping through his docket for the next case, a property dispute, nothing significant, he didn't yet realize that the real case about to unfold had nothing to do with property or noise complaints or code violations, but rather with his own legacy, his own long shadow cast over decades of rulings. And as the bailiff approached quietly, something in his eyes signaled urgency, the kind that rarely reached Whitmore's bench. And when he leaned in and whispered, "Sir, there's someone from the Justice Department here to see you," Whitmore froze, the words sinking into him like sudden ice water, and he looked up, confused but composed, as always, lips tightening, mind calculating. Justice Department. Now why? And then the doors creaked open, and in walked the man Whitmore least expected, the man he thought he had belittled and dismissed just hours earlier, the one he had reduced to nothing more than a traffic violator with an attitude. But this time Marcus Reed wasn't dressed like a defendant, wasn't standing in the audience, wasn't fidgeting under the scrutiny of court procedure. Instead, he moved with purpose, with gravity, with the stillness of a storm about to break, and he carried no legal pad, no desperate plea, only a leather badge wallet which he placed gently but deliberately on the judge's bench. Flipping it open to reveal the seal of the United States Department of Justice and his credentials as Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus L. Reed, and the courtroom fell into an unnatural silence, the kind that happens when reality itself stops to watch what's about to happen. And Whitmore's face changed, not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the subtle, devastating way a man realizes he has grossly misjudged the battlefield, his opponent, and the stakes, and he swallowed hard, his throat dry, because power, once assumed absolute, becomes fragile the moment it is questioned by an equal or worse by a superior. And Marcus spoke without raising his voice, but with every syllable sharpened by the precision of a federal prosecutor who knew exactly what he was doing. And he said, "Your Honor, as of this moment, your courtroom is under formal preliminary review for racial bias, procedural misconduct, and violations of the Civil Rights Act under Title VI." And Whitmore blinked once, a slow and stunned response, as if trying to process not just the words, but the authority behind them, and for the first time in years, maybe decades. He felt uncertain in his own courtroom, and he stood almost on instinct, as if standing could make him bigger, stronger, still the dominant figure. But Marcus didn't flinch, didn't move back, just met the judge's gaze with a calm that was more powerful than any outburst, more damning than any accusation, because Marcus wasn't angry anymore. He was methodical, a prosecutor on mission, and the courtroom staff, the clerks, even the bailiff, they didn't interrupt, didn't question it, because something about Marcus's presence had shifted the natural order of the room, and everyone knew it, even if no one spoke it. And Whitmore finally said, "This is irregular," trying to summon his old tone, the one that shut people down, but it came out weaker than he intended, and Marcus replied, "No, sir, this is overdue," and handed him a sealed folder with the official DOJ insignia outlining the scope of the investigation. And it wasn't just about Marcus's case anymore. Inside that folder were statistics, charts, sworn affidavits, historical sentencing data, evidence that Judge Whitmore's courtroom had a provable pattern of disproportionately harsh fines, penalties, and rulings against black and brown defendants, particularly in non-violent infractions, where judicial discretion was broad. And Marcus continued, now speaking not just to Whitmore but to the court, to history itself. "We've identified over 70 cases in the last 3 years alone where similarly situated white defendants received significantly reduced fines or no penalty at all, while defendants of color were subjected to maximum sentences, threats of contempt, and, in some cases, coerced guilty pleas." And Whitmore tried to interrupt, tried to speak, but Marcus raised his hand, not rudely but with the authority of someone who no longer needed permission to speak in this space, and added, "The Department of Justice has taken an interest in this jurisdiction as part of a broader Civil Rights Division audit into judicial equity across the South." And now the courtroom was no longer just a space for rulings. It was a scene of reckoning, a stage where roles had flipped, and for once justice didn't flow from the bench downward, but was rising from the floor, from the people, through the very system Whitmore had spent his life believing he could control. And as the judge glanced down at the folder, reading the summary page with his name printed in bold under the section titled "Subject of Review," the color drained slowly from his face, and all the arrogance, all the generational confidence that had once made him invincible began to erode, because this wasn't a complaint filed by a disgruntled litigant. This was a federal investigation with institutional backing, media implications, and the power to unseat him, to strip his robe, to bury his legacy under the weight of numbers and names and laws he had long ignored. And Marcus, knowing exactly what this moment meant, finished with, "We are requesting all court audio transcripts and docket logs from the past 5 years, effective immediately." And before Whitmore could respond, Marcus added, "Non-compliance will be considered obstruction and will be addressed at the federal level." And then, with quiet finality, he turned and walked out, not triumphant, not smug, but resolved, because this wasn't personal revenge, it was professional justice. And as he exited the courtroom, the door closing behind him like the end of an era, everyone inside sat motionless, staring at the judge who for the first time looked small beneath the weight of his own bench, his own history, his own choices, and somewhere, deep in the bones of the building itself, A silence settled in that felt like something ancient dying, and something new being born. The storm didn't begin with thunder. It began with silence, then whispers, then questions, then noise, growing louder by the hour until the courthouse that had once echoed only with the sterile hum of bureaucracy now trembled beneath the weight of public scrutiny, media flashbulbs, and the rising chants of protesters demanding justice, not just for Marcus Reed, but for every name that had passed through Judge Ronald Whitmore's courtroom and left marked, bruised or broken. And it was almost poetic how quickly the illusion of order unraveled when someone with power simply refused to be silent, because within 48 hours of Marcus revealing his badge and the federal investigation in open court, the headlines exploded like matchsticks tossed on dry kindling. Federal prosecutor flips courtroom power dynamic. Racial bias exposed in Alabama court. DOJ targets judge with history of discrimination. And suddenly Montgomery County wasn't a sleepy southern district anymore. It was the eye of a storm, a battleground of accountability, and the courthouse itself became both symbol and spectacle. Surrounded by news vans, legal activists, college students holding signs, veterans with "Justice for All" patches sewn into worn denim jackets, and local citizens who'd never once considered they might have been victims of systemic targeting now stepping forward, their voices cracking not from fear but from long overdue recognition. And Marcus, despite the sudden glare of national attention, didn't bask in the spotlight. He went to work, harder than ever, back and forth between Montgomery and Atlanta, reviewing evidence, issuing formal subpoenas, listening to stories. So many stories, each one like a wound wrapped in paperwork. The young black woman fined $800 for a cracked tail light she couldn't afford to fix. The Latino father sentenced to 30 days for contempt when he tried to explain he didn't understand the court interpreter. The elderly veteran told to shut his mouth by Whitmore when he questioned an overcharge on a traffic ticket. And though these cases had been invisible once, they now had oxygen. They now had Marcus, and he wasn't just documenting abuse. He was building a pattern, threading every incident into a narrative so irrefutable that even the judge's supporters, local donors, retired lawyers, members of the city council, began to fall silent, unsure whether to defend him or distance themselves. And Whitmore, once so smug, so towering in his courtroom, was now reduced to terse public statements, awkward interviews, and ultimately the cold language of a formal administrative suspension. As the Judicial Oversight Committee placed him on leave pending full investigation, and Marcus watched it all not with triumph, but with the gravity of a man who understood exactly what this moment meant. For him, for his parents, for every little boy who had ever been taught to watch his tone in a courtroom, for every defendant who knew they weren't just fighting a ticket, they were fighting an institution. And yet even as the public rallied and the walls of privilege began to crack, Marcus remained focused on the deeper wound, the system itself. Not just the judge, because he knew Whitmore was only one head of a hydra, one symptom of a larger sickness, and true justice meant going further, deeper. And so he drafted a sweeping reform proposal alongside civil rights attorneys and policy scholars that would require racial impact audits of all municipal courts receiving federal funding, create mandatory bias training for judges and prosecutors, and introduce citizen review panels in communities with a history of disproportionate sentencing. And he pushed it forward not with outrage but with facts, charts, legislative pathways, and constitutional grounding. And in every interview, every press conference, every conversation with reporters asking if he felt vindicated, he answered the same way. This isn't about me. It's about the people who were told they didn't matter. And slowly, the narrative shifted from scandal to reform, from outrage to hope. And even as Whitmore prepared his legal defense, backed by lawyers who had once called him Ronnie the Rock, for his unshakable rulings, it was clear something had changed permanently. Because now every case he had ruled on was being re-examined. Every defendant offered a second chance, and across the South other judges took notice, their rulings suddenly more careful, their tones less commanding, as if they had all heard the unspoken message. The era of untouchable robes was ending, and through it all Marcus kept working, tirelessly, relentlessly, driven not by ego but by duty, carrying the weight of those who'd never had a voice and determined not to let their pain be in vain, and sometimes, late at night, when the courthouse steps were empty and the cameras had gone, he would sit alone in the courtroom gallery, replaying every moment from that first hearing. Not to relive the humiliation, but to remember the ignition point, the moment one man decided not to shrink, and that memory became his compass, his fire, his vow to never let silence return to this place again. Months had passed since the dust first began to settle on what many were calling a historic reckoning in Montgomery County's judicial system, and the once quiet halls of power had been flooded not just with legal documents and subpoenas, but with voices of the marginalized, the silenced, the overlooked, and most importantly, the hopeful. And Marcus Reed found himself standing before a crowd unlike any he had faced before, not as the relentless federal prosecutor digging through court records or the man who had challenged a judge's authority inside a courtroom, but as the keynote speaker at a nationally televised civil rights conference held in the heart of Washington, D.C., where banners reading "Justice for All" fluttered above a packed auditorium filled with activists, lawmakers, legal scholars, and everyday citizens who had come to witness a story that had begun with a single traffic citation and exploded into a movement. And as Marcus looked out across the sea of faces, young and old, black and white, Latino, Native American, Asian, all united by a common desire for change, he felt the weight of responsibility and hope pressing on his chest, a reminder that his fight was no longer his alone, but belonged to countless others who had suffered in silence under the weight of systemic injustice. And he began, his voice steady and resolute. Our justice system must serve everyone, regardless of race, title, or background. I didn't walk into that courtroom expecting a fight, but I also didn't walk out of it afraid. And the applause swelled, not just as recognition of his words, but as an affirmation of a shared belief that change was possible. And throughout his speech, Marcus recounted the path that led him here. From the humiliating citation issued by Judge Whitmore's courtroom, the discovery of biased rulings hidden in plain sight, the federal investigation that shook a small southern town's judicial foundation, to the broader implications his case revealed about the deeply entrenched inequalities that permeated court systems across the country. And he spoke not just about the fight, but about the solutions, about the legislative reforms drafted and passed, about mandatory racial bias training now required in every municipal court receiving federal funds, about the new citizen oversight panels that gave communities a voice in holding their judges accountable, and about the technology that made data transparent and accessible to the public for the first time. And as he detailed these victories, the audience hung on his every word, understanding that these weren't just policies, but lifelines for millions, trapped in a cycle of unfairness. And as he closed, Marcus fixed his gaze on the cameras broadcasting live around the globe, his voice strong, clear, and unwavering. To anyone who's ever been silenced, targeted, or disrespected, you have a voice. Use it. You have rights. Defend them. And to those in power, remember, the law does not serve your ego. It serves justice. And the room erupted in applause, standing ovations echoing down the marble halls long after he left the stage. But even amidst the accolades and media attention, Marcus remained grounded, knowing the true work was just beginning, because justice was not a moment, but a movement, a daily commitment to equality, fairness, and humanity. And in the months following his speech, the DOJ expanded its oversight program nationwide, investigating other districts with similar complaints, inspired by the blueprint his case had created, and he was called to testify before Congress multiple times, providing expert recommendations on judicial reform and racial equity, while at home, Marcus's family, his parents, who had sacrificed so much to raise him with dignity and discipline, his siblings who cheered quietly from the sidelines, watched proudly as the man they knew as Marcus became a symbol of courage and integrity to a generation hungry for change. And although his days were filled with meetings, press interviews, and policy debates, Marcus still made time to mentor young lawyers of color, urging them to be fierce, fearless, and unrelenting, reminding them that the courtroom was not just a place for legal battles, but a front line for human dignity. And on quiet evenings, when the noise faded and the city lights twinkled outside his office window, he reflected on how a seemingly small moment, a traffic stop, a fine, a judge's smirk, had ignited something far greater than himself, something that transcended law and politics and spoke to the soul of a nation struggling to live up to its founding promises. And somewhere deep inside, Marcus understood that while the battle had been won in court, the war for justice and equality was ongoing, a fight that required vigilance, courage, and hope. But he was ready to stand not just as a prosecutor or a speaker, but as a leader, a voice for the voiceless, a beacon in a system too long broken because Marcus Reed's story had become more than just a courtroom drama. It had become a movement. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because every time we bring you raw truth, deep stories, and lessons that challenge the way you think.